May God be merciful to us and bless us, show the light of his countenance and come to us. Amen. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. John 5, verse 5, if you were wondering. Rather unusually today, we have a choice of gospel readings. Norma and I will be using the first on our sheets from John 14 in our services in church today. But I'd like now to think about the second of those two passages, John 5, 1 to 9. It'll give us a different perspective online, and also because that verse has come to have a special meaning for me. You may not have come across it before. I first became aware of it through Ray Chapman, a friend at our church in Northern Virginia, some 30 years or so ago now. It had an even greater significance for Ray, and I take its appearance in our lectionary today as a sign that I might tell you some of his story. Ray and I were chatting over coffee after the service one Sunday morning. We were comparing notes about the local traffic. I told him that I rode to work each day in downtown Washington in what they call over there a van pool, a group of people who lived and worked in roughly the same areas and who would ride together in what we would call a minibus, owned by one of the group. The advantage to this arrangement was that there were 2 additional lanes down the centre of the interstate into DC, which were designated as HOV3, high occupancy vehicle. Traffic in those lanes would be moving at 65. 70 is faster than they're allowed in America, but the regular lanes would be gridlocked. Traffic using those lanes with less than 3 people in the car would get a fine. And it got bigger if you tried to fool the cops by sticking clothing store dummies in your car. People did try and didn't get very far. Occasionally, when the owner of the van was out of town, I used to act as the driver. Well, said Ray, if you can drive that, you can drive the Facets wagon. Facets was a voluntary organisation which supported homeless families, given temporary shelter by social services in the 2-bit motels which lined some of the roads in and out of DC. The wagon would call each evening wherever there were children to make sure that they got at least one cooked meal a day. Ray drove it every Sunday, had done so for some years, and he needed the occasional break. So from then on, one Sunday a month, I drove the Facets wagon, and I got to know some of the kids. One month I took a camera so the people who donated the food could see where it ended up. I'd worried though that the kids might resent this, the rich folk taking them food to feel good about themselves. But I was always greeted with smiles and laughter, and particularly so the next month when I handed out copies of the photos that I'd taken. But I think I can honestly say that the experience of driving that wagon was the start, at least, of a process which shaped the rest of my life. But you may be wondering, what has all this got to do with John 5:5? For some of the activities the church ran, we all wore denim work shirts, decorated with badges and patches that our friends had given us. Across the back was always some appropriate quotation, appropriate to the wearer. Ray's was a Bible reference, John 5:5. What's all that about? I asked him one day. I didn't get an answer at the time. But a few weeks later, Ray stood up in front of the congregation and told his story. Some years previously, he'd woke up one morning knowing he'd been dreaming. A very vivid dream, but one of which he could remember only one thing, that Bible reference, John 5:5. Something told him it was important, but he'd no idea in what way. "Well," said Ellie, his wife, "you'd better look it up and see what it says." Ellie was wise that way, the sort of person who, when you're lost in an unfamiliar town, will suddenly say, "I think we should go down there." And in 2 minutes you'd found the place you were looking for. So Ray found a Bible, and there it was. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. He read it, and he was just as baffled. Now, the biblical writers had a particular relationship with numbers. Only occasionally were they precise. The 12 tribes, the 10 commandments. Most of the time, numbers would be rounded into something familiar. 7 fat years followed by 7 lean years in Joseph's Egypt. 40 years in the desert for Moses. 40 days in the wilderness, and so on. So why, here, the precision? Why 38 years? Why not the more familiar 40? Why was 38 and not 40 important? "What were you doing 38 years ago?" asked Ellie. 38 years earlier, Ray had been an officer in the US Air Force during the Second World War. He'd been due to take a military flight to Canada, but at the last minute his orders were changed, and he didn't board the flight. The plane left without him, and was never heard of again. 38 years later, Ray was something big in finance, and ruthless in driving through to the goal that he had set. He went to church on Sunday, sure, but by his own admission that didn't feature much Monday to Saturday. And that dream, that verse, changed his life forever. For 38 years, he realised, he'd been metaphorically ill, lying by the pool. It was time to stand up, take his mat, and walk. Working for Facets was just one example of that, and I only wish I could tell the story here today with as much passion as Ray did that day in our church in Virginia. But why do I tell you this? What does Ray's story matter to us? Honestly, I don't know. Except that I realised sometime later that I was just 38 years old when I first heard Ray's story and began driving the Facets wagon. Somehow that number must be important. So as I heard Ray's story then, I think I meant to pass it on to you today. I don't know what special meaning it might have for any one of you. I just invite you to think about it. And I ask, like Ellie did, what were you doing 38 years ago? You don't need to answer aloud or tell me, just think about it. No one but you needs to know what happened then, what it means today. And it may be that there's no one for whom it means anything at all. But just maybe there is someone listening for whom, as it did for Ray, it means the world. And if you're that person, then may God bless you and be merciful to you, show the light of his countenance, and come to you. Amen.